Providence and Worcester Railroad. To the north, across the Massachusetts line, the city of Worcester was beginning to develop a railroad junction. The early Boston and Worcester Railroad had connected the city with Boston. And in 1839, the Western Railroad opened to Springfield. Their connections were later made to Albany, New York. In 1840, the Norwich and Worcester Railroad opened, connecting Worcester with the head of navigation of the Thames River in Norwich. In 1848, the Worcester and Nashville Railroad linked the two manufacturing cities and established a gateway for tourism, which began in earnest in the 1850s in the mountains of New Hampshire. During the early part of this period, the Blackstone Valley didn't have a railroad, but it did have the Blackstone Canal, which was an asset to those who used it, but not a profit generator for its owners, because its construction costs were much higher than anticipated, and its maintenance costs were also high. More of it, and yet another example of the law of unintended consequences. The very success and utility of the canal causes primary users, the mill owners, to rise against it and urge construction of a railroad. Why? The mills on the Blackstone River were all water powered, and the canal tapped a significant amount of that water to float its boats, as it were. That meant less water for power generation, hence less output for the mills. There was even a real oddity in New England, a narrow gauge steam railroad. The Worcester and Shrewsbury Railroad, which never reached Shrewsbury, was a 2.7-mile long railroad that ran from downtown Worcester to a popular amusement area, Lake Winnismont. The locomotive, as you will learn later, was affectionately called the Dummy, because it looked like a streetcar and was muffled so it wouldn't scare horses. This line lived an astoundingly long life, outliving many of the real railroads that dwarfed it. It lasted to the late 1920s. In 1844, discussions began in Providence about the possibility of building a railroad between Providence and Worcester. As was the case with the Boston and Worcester Railroad, most of the capital and political influence originated from the larger terminal cities. Following the practice of the time, charters of the time were obtained from two state legislators. In 1845, two charters merged into a single corporate entity, the Providence and Worcester Railroad. In 1845, before the charter was obtained, an engineer named Willis Pratt was hired to survey a possible route. Pratt's report was a model of clarity. It explained from his non-technical use a fundamental concept on the laying out of a railroad, what is today called the ruling grade. The ruling grade is the steepest portion of the line, and it's the steepness of the ruling grade that is one of the most important determinants of costs of having, say, a ton of freight. The energy cost to raise a carload of potatoes over a hill is very sensitive to the steepness of the railroad grade. For example, let's say between Providence and Worcester, you could build a line that had a gentle constant grade, all well and good. But suppose it was a single hill, you would have to add each train a second or third locomotive that would only be needed on the hill, or you might have to use a much hungrier single locomotive. As a result, by building around the hill, your initial cost might be a bit higher due to construction expenses, but your long-term operating costs would be lower. The Dummy. Shrewsbury. Jesse Johnson, known as J.J. Coburn, ventured off to California at the age of 18 back in 1850. He joined relatives there that had gone west for the gold rush. After a few years with many exciting adventures, he came back to Worcester with some of his savings. Then he worked in the metal and iron business for a time. He then decided to develop Lake Winnismont as a pleasure resort and a site for summer homes. He built the Winnismont House, a hotel on Ramshorn Island, got steamboats running on the lake, and then created Lincoln Park, a very early amusement park on the Worcester shore. He also developed the Lakeview neighborhood with many streets and homes. In order to bring patrons out of Worcester down to his lake resort, he began running the narrow gauge Worcester and Shrewsbury Railroad from Union Station down to the corner of Lake Avenue and Route 9. Our photograph shows the line's engine number 3. There were eventually 10 engines, as it is reported the daily passengers during the summer months numbered in the thousands. The little railroad, known as the Dummy, actually never ran into the then little village of Shrewsbury. Despite several attempts to extend the line, it was eventually electrified to a trolley line and replaced completely when bus service was instituted. Willis Pratt pictures suggested following the route of the old Blackstone Canal all the way from Worcester to Providence by the 1840s. The canal had fallen into complete disuse and had been totally abandoned in 1848. In fact, in the mid-1840s, the organizers of the railroad bought the canal to secure the right-of-way. In some areas, Pratt recommended building over the old canal. He noted in his report, however, that in other surveys suggested an alternate southern approach to Providence that would not follow the route of the canal exactly. This alternate route would be slightly longer and have a steeper ruined grades than the canal following route, but it would be close to the developing population centers immediately north of Providence, offering the possibility of more passenger traffic. This route, which was eventually adopted, branched off at the canal at the long forgotten but delightfully named village of Sinking Fund, Rhode Island. More history on Sinking Fund to come. From Sinking Fund, the line went roughly north of Lonsdale, through Valley Falls, Pawtucket, and then into Providence from Pawtucket south. This is basically the Amtrak line into Providence today. One huge issue had to be resolved, though the route of the line could finally be determined. What would happen when the railroad reached Providence? Last time. Providence had undergone several dramatic makeovers, in each case altering the landscape in such a way as to make the previous version unrecognizable. By the early 1840s, the Boston and Providence Railroad had a large station in the area of today's India Point Park, and the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad trains continued to terminate at Collier Point. It was still necessary to take a ferry between two stations. Both existing stations were in areas that were becoming increasingly industrialized, were miles south of the center of the city's residential area. The focus of this commercial area was an abatement of the Providence River called the Cove. It's difficult to visualize today, but the bounded area by Exchange Street to the south, Pleasant Valley Parkway to the west, Providence Way to the north, and Canal Street to the east were all underwater, with marshland on both borders. As the Providence and Worcester Railroad approached the city's other two railroads, having termini distant from the population center, time was right for discussions about a new single railroad terminal for Providence. The Providence and Worcester Railroad took the initiative and requested both permission and subsidy in the form of a land grant from the city of Providence to build a new station, the first in the United States. The new station would be located on the southern border of the Cove, most of which would be filled in. In addition to enthusiasm for predictable commercial quarters, there was opposition from the ancestors of today's environmentalists, who objected to the loss of open space and the pleasant walking areas on the boundaries of the Cove. Like today's Promenade Street, progress was not to be denied. However, a compact was entered between the three railroads and the city of Providence to build a new station. Before the station could be built, however, there would have to be some dramatic realignments of the existing railroads. In the meantime, with assurance of a terminal location, final corporate organization and construction of the Providence and Worcester Railroad began. Pictures of the old railroad stations. The one on the left is the old Test station with the city hall in the background. The Cove, still quite large at this time, is back of the station. The co-joined sub-instant nature of the station can clearly be seen. It's really two separate stations, but at end to end, the track in the foreground, the straight track of the Providence and Worcester Railroad, run by the docks on the west side of the Providence River. On the right side, the same station, the Test station, the old Central Fire Station in mid-background, and the spire of the First Baptist Meeting House in far background. This was the First Baptist Church in America. The statue of General Ambrose Burnside can be seen dating a photograph after 1886. The statue, cost a whopping $40,000, approximately $1 million today. Colonel Burnside was everyone held in high regard. Issued in 1845, the original charter of the Providence and Worcester Railroad was highly unusual for the times and tells us much about the mixed feelings communities in the financial establishment had about railroads at the time. The first article component was a specification that the maximum annual stockholder dividend was to be 12%. This sounds generous by today's terms, but not so for the day. What this meant in practical terms was that if there was a profit generated of the dividend maximum, those funds were to be put back into the railroad rather than into the shareholders' pockets. The implication of this is clear. The Providence and Worcester Railroad was to be built to provide a service rather than to maximize profits for shareholders. In an era of unbridled and largely unregulated capitalism, where did this seeming altruism come from? A look at the list of stockholders suggests the answer. They were mostly men who had industrial interests along the route of the railroad. It was to their advantage of their primary businesses to have a well-built and well-run railroad through their industries. The second component is highly unusual and may provide the first known example of a poison pill, stockholder protection. The poison pill structure is usually attributed to Martin Lipton, a corporate lawyer who described it in 1982 during the era of hostile takeover. The idea of a hostile takeover was explored in the 1991 movie Other People's Money, starring Danny DeVito. A hostile takeover, corporate raider looks for a company that has lots of tangible assets like cash, inventory, or plant, but a low stock price, perhaps because the company is in an unglamorous business. Secretly, the raider buys enough shares to secure sufficient seats on the board of directors to gain control of the company. Once achieving control, the captive board votes to liquidate the company and distribute the profits to shareholders who make bundles of money. The fictional company in the movie was called the New England Wire and Cable Company, and exteriors were shot at the actual wire mill in Georgetown, Connecticut, called the Gilbert and Bennett Mills. Ironically, after the movie, Gilbert and Bennett, the real company, was subject to a hostile takeover by Coatis. The company was dismembered in 2001. Providence and Worcester Railroad's poison pill provided a complex mechanism that ensured that if the outsiders tried to buy the company, the price of the stock would automatically be jacked up enough to repel the attack. In the case of the Providence and Worcester Railroad, the idea of the structure was to keep the railroad intact to service its area and rebuff predators who might buy a local railroad to milk it dry. So it appeared that the original directors of the Providence and Worcester Railroad were about 140 years of their time. Construction of the Providence and Worcester Railroad began in 1847 and was swift and relatively uneventful. At about the same time, work started on a new station, and the other two railroads were sure began the track realignments. Both railroads independently that would be inefficient and costly to extend their lines north from the existing terminals. For the Stonington line, an extension would require running through what would become very expensive real estate. For the Boston and Providence Railroad, College Hill would be forced the tracks right along a major thoroughfare. Something more drastic would be needed. For the Boston and Providence Railroad, the decision was made to build a 4.5-mile extension from the existing main line at Dodgeville, Massachusetts, a bit south of Attleboro, to a junction with the new railroad line in the north end of Pawtucket. The point of origin of this line in Attleboro is known as the East Junction. The intersection with the Providence and Worcester Railroad in Central Falls is called Boston Switch. These names are used today by the railroaders operating trains over these lines. The original Boston and Providence Railroad line to East Providence survives and is owned today by the Providence and Worcester Railroad line in its Rhode Island portion and by the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, whose trains today are operated by the Massachusetts Commuter Railroad Company, MASC. Collectively, it's known as the East Junction Branch. Original ownership of the Providence section of the main line was shared by the Boston and Providence Railroad and Providence and Worcester Railroad, but today co-owners are Amtrak and the Providence and Worcester Railroad. The process of building a new entrance to Providence in the Stonehenge line was a bit more complex. From the south, the new line branched off to the old main, which is today's Providence and Worcester Railroad's Harbor Branch line. There's a baseball field and Roger Williams Park. From there, the line bent to the west until it intersected the row of today's 610 connector highway into Providence. The original line in Providence was located south of today's Amtrak line.